Shakespeare and math. Not two things that you necessarily put together right.
Right, not your usual pairing, like finding out your favorite musician was secretly a chess grandmaster.
Totally. But get ready to be surprised, because today we're diving into the unexpected world of Shakespeare and numbers.
We're talking about Rob Eastaway's Much Ado About Numbers.
And trust me, it's way more interesting than it might sound.
Definitely. It's easy to think about Shakespeare's genius as purely literary.
All about the words.
Yeah, but this book shows something fascinating. Math was a big deal in Elizabethan England, and you can see it reflected in Shakespeare's plays in some really unexpected ways.
So less iambic pentameter, more like Shakespeare doing his taxes.
Haha, well, not exactly. But we are talking about how numbers, calculations, even the concept of nothing played a part in Shakespeare's world and his work.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Give me the Elizabethan England crash course. What was it like when it came to math?
All right, imagine this. You're in Elizabethan England, the main number system, Roman numerals.
Whoa, seriously. Those things were tough enough in school.
Can you imagine trying to run a business using Roman numerals?
My brain just exploded a little bit.
Right, it was a completely different world. But then, things changed. Right before Shakespeare was born, Arabic numerals hit the scene.
Arabic numerals, you mean like 1, 2, 3?
Exactly. And it wasn't just a change in how you wrote numbers, it was a revolution. Suddenly, math was faster, more efficient, and trade exploded. Ideas could spread faster than ever before.
Talk about a game changer. So, Shakespeare was basically growing up in this time of massive mathematical upheaval.
Exactly. He was surrounded by new ideas about numbers. And one of the most interesting things Eastaway looks at is how the concept of nothing, zero, comes into play.
You know, I never really thought about it like that, but the idea of zero is actually kind of mind-blowing when you really think about it.
It really is. And Shakespeare plays with this new concept of nothing in really clever ways. Like, take the title, Much Ado About Nothing. It's not just a catchy phrase.
It's a pun.
A multi-layered pun. Eastaway points out that nothing had some, let's say, more colorful slang meanings in Elizabethan England. One of them even referred to, well, let's just say female anatomy.
No way. So Shakespeare is making a racy joke, A&D playing with this new mathematical idea at the same time.
It goes to show his genius. Shakespeare understood that nothing wasn't just the absence of something, it had its own power, its own meaning. And that kind of leads us to a big question. What about Shakespeare's own education?
Right, where did he learn all this stuff? Was there some secret Elizabethan math club we don't know about?
You'd think he must have had some intense math tutoring, but it turns out that wasn't really the case.
Like, really?
Back then, a good education was all about Latin and the classics. Picture Shakespeare as a schoolboy, hunched over his Latin grammar instead of algebra equations.
Wow, so no Khan Academy for young Shakespeare.
Nope. Eastaway actually includes an example of a grammar school schedule from that time. It's Latin, Latin, and more Latin.
Talk about a one-track curriculum.
Yeah.
So if Shakespeare wasn't learning about math in school, where was he picking it up?
Think about the world he was living in. Merchants, traders, even everyday people needed to be good at math to get by. It was practical math in action.
It's like needing to know how to split the bill at dinner, but on a much larger scale.
Exactly. Eastaway uses the example of this incredible woman, Bess of Hardwick. She was a real power player in Elizabethan England, and a big part of her success was her amazing head for business and finance.
Well, Bess of Hardwick was like the CEO of her time.
Exactly. And Shakespeare, running a theater company, would have needed those same skills. Contracts, negotiations, budgeting it all meant he had to be good with numbers.
Makes sense. But it wasn't all business and numbers all the time.
Right.
I mean, those Elizabethans knew how to have a good time.
Oh, for sure. They loved their games.
Like what? Give us the Elizabethan game night rundown.
They had all sorts of card games, like Primero, which was kind of like an early version of poker, and then there were dice games like Hazard.
Hazard. I feel like that name's a bit of a giveaway.
It definitely was a game of risk.
And speaking of Hazard, Eastaway actually connects this dice game to the early ideas about probability. That's wild.
It's true. Think about it, even without knowing the fancy math behind it, experienced hazard players had a good feel for the odds. They knew which bets were more likely to win.
So like those seasoned poker players who just seem to have a sixth sense.
It wasn't until much later that Galileo came along and actually put the math behind those gut feelings and developed the formal theory of probability.
It's amazing how ahead of their time they were. Those gamblers in the gaming dens were practically proto-mathematicians.
Right. It's like they were playing with the building blocks of probability without even realizing it.
Speaking of things that are a bit risky, Didn't that phrase at sixes and sevens come from Hazard? You know, like things were at sixes and sevens.
That's exactly where it comes from.
I never would have guessed.
6 and 7, they were the riskiest numbers to shoot for in Hazard. So if you were playing those odds, people saw you as kind of reckless, like you were headed for trouble, you know?
Definitely a recipe for chaos.
Yeah.
Okay, so from games of chance to something a little grander, Shakespeare and his obsession with time. I mean, you see it everywhere in his plays. The stars, the planets, the passage of time. It's like he's always got one eye on the cosmos.
He definitely was fascinated by time. And to really get it, we have to think about what timekeeping was like back then. No iPhones, no digital clocks, nothing like that.
What did they even use?
You had sundials, but good luck on a cloudy day, right? Hourglasses were common, but someone had to keep flipping them. And then, of course, there was the church bell booming out the hours for everyone to hear.
I can just imagine. Time was something you felt in your bones.
It was a much more physical, almost tangible thing. And you can see how that would have influenced how Shakespeare thought about time. It's a constant presence in his work, a force that pushes his characters along.
And then there's the imagery. He uses all those stars, planets, celestial bodies. He uses them so beautifully. But they weren't just for decoration, were they? It was a reflection of how Elizabethans saw the universe, right?
Absolutely. Shakespeare was writing at this really interesting moment in history. The Ptolemaic system, with the Earth at the center of the universe, it was still the dominant model.
Like that incredible astronomical clock Eastaway describes, the one at Hampton Court Palace, with the Earth right in the middle and the sun moving around it on the hour hand.
Exactly. That clock is like a perfect snapshot of the Elizabethan worldview. But while Shakespeare was alive, that whole Earth-centered view, it started to fall apart, mainly because of Galileo.
Galileo, astronomy's biggest rebel.
He was. His observations, especially the ones with Jupiter's moons, were really strong evidence against that whole Earth-centric idea. And this is where it gets really cool. Eastaway actually thinks that Shakespeare might have known about Galileo's discoveries.
Hold on, are we saying Shakespeare was sneaking into Galileo's observatory?
Maybe not literally, but Eastaway points to this one scene in Cymbeline where Jupiter comes down from the heavens and he's got these 4 ghosts circling him. It's possible that those 4 ghosts were a little nod to Jupiter's 4 largest moons that Galileo had observed.
Whoa, Shakespeare dropping hints about cutting-edge astronomy in his plays. That's next-level genius. It makes you wonder what else he might have been subtly referencing in his work.
Yeah.
But let's come back down to Earth for a minute. Eastaway also talks about how even something as simple as a rainbow was kind of a mathematical puzzle back then.
It's true. We take rainbows for granted now. We know it's just light refracting through water droplets. But back then, rainbows were still pretty mysterious. They even argued about how many colors were in a rainbow.
Really?
Oh, yeah. Some people, going back to those ancient Greek ideas, they thought a rainbow only had 3 colors. Others said 4 because of the 4 elements: earth, air, fire, and water.
So it wasn't just about pretty colors, it was a whole philosophical debate.
It all tied into this bigger struggle to understand light and color. And this was happening at the same time as all these new mathematical ideas about optics were emerging.
And that's where Thomas Harriot comes in, right?
Exactly.
Eastaway talks about him, this guy who was a contemporary of Shakespeare, doing all this groundbreaking work with optics, studying how light bends and separates into different colors.
He was way ahead of his time. Makes you wonder, did Shakespeare and Harriet ever meet?
It'd be like the Renaissance version of a celebrity hangout.
Right, and it's definitely possible they both knew some of the same people. It just goes to show how interconnected things were back then, even in different fields. New ideas about math and science weren't stuck in some dusty old library. They were being talked about and debated everywhere, even in the places where Shakespeare might have hung out.
It's like you open one door to a new world, and it just leads to a million other doors. I mean, who knew that Shakespeare's world was so full of math, even in places you wouldn't expect?
It's everywhere when you start to look. Even in something as basic as Shakespeare's writing tools, Eastaway finds these cool connections to math.
You mean like quill pens and ink? That's getting pretty granular, isn't it?
Think about it. It wasn't as simple as just picking up a feather and starting to write. The angle you cut the quill, the way you held it, it all affected the thickness of the lines, how smoothly the ink flowed. It was a real skill.
It's like calligraphy almost, an art form.
Exactly. There was a precision to it and attention to detail that's kind of mathematical when you think about it.
And those quills would have needed constant sharpening.
Oh yeah, definitely. It makes you appreciate how much work went into just writing anything down back then.
No kidding. Okay, but what about the ink itself? I mean, did they just buy that at the store?
Not quite. Eastaway describes how they made ink back then. It was a whole process. They'd mix together things like iron sulfate and oak galls, sometimes even adding in gum arabic.
Sounds like a recipe for, well, I'm not sure what.
It's amazing when you realize that those ingredients came from all over. We're talking global trade routes, centuries ago, just to make ink.
Wow. So globalization wasn't just a 20th century thing.
Not at all. And then once those plays were written, they had to be printed, right?
Which back then meant using a printing press.
Yeah.
A relatively new invention at the time. Talk about a game changer.
Totally. But printing with a printing press also came with its own set of mathematical challenges.
Eastaway actually goes into all the calculations the printers had to do. The layout of the page, the spaces between the lines, how many copies to print. It all affected how much the books cost, how far they could be distributed.
Exactly. It was a whole logistical puzzle. And of course, we can't forget about the money side of things. Shakespeare wasn't just an artist, he was a businessman too. He had a stake in his theater company, and Eastaway actually breaks down the financial realities of that time.
It's pretty mind-blowing to see how much everyday things cost back then. And they were dealing with multiple currencies, exchange rates, even inflation.
Sounds stressful.
And yet, Shakespeare was able to thrive in that environment. It really highlights his business acumen. But it's not just about the literal money, is it? Eastaway also points out how often Shakespeare uses metaphors about money in his work.
All the time.
And it's not just about being wealthy or poor. Money represents something deeper, like love or loyalty, maybe even fate.
It's true. He uses those metaphors to explore these big universal themes.
It's like money becomes this whole language, a way of measuring what really matters, whether it's tangible or not.
Exactly. It's another layer of meaning that Shakespeare was able to layer into his work.
It all goes back to that idea of Shakespeare having a mathematical mind. He may not have been writing equations or doing geometry proofs.
But he understood the power of numbers. He saw the patterns, the logic, the way things fit together.
And he used all of that to create these incredible works of art that we're still talking about centuries later.
Yeah.
It just goes to show that math is more than just formulas and equations. It's a way of seeing the world, and Shakespeare clearly saw it.
Absolutely. So the next time you're reading Shakespeare or watching one of his plays, pay attention. You might be surprised by how much math is woven into the story.
It makes you wonder what other secrets are hidden in plain sight.